The afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the quiet suburban street, where 5-year-old Lan Chi danced barefoot on the lawn in her pink dress, twirling with the carefree joy only a child could possess. Her mother, Hung, watched lovingly from the kitchen window, a smile tugging at her lips as she spoke with her sister on the phone. It was meant to be an ordinary day, a safe day. But all it took was 4 minutes. 4 minutes that would change everything. When Hung returned to the yard, the sight stopped her breath. The gate was ajar. Her eyes darted frantically, and there, near the curb, stood a black van with its side door slightly open. A man knelt beside Lan Chi, his smile too wide, too polished. "I have puppies in my van," he coaxed, his voice smooth and practiced. "Special ones. They need a little girl to take care of them. Would you like to see?" Panic surged through Hung's chest as she screamed, "Lan Chi!" The man's head snapped up, his expression instantly hardening. In a flash, he grabbed the child's arm. But Lan Chi didn't scream. She didn't fight. Her body froze, her wide, unblinking eyes locked on his face, as if paralyzed by a fear too deep for words. Across the street, an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Nguyen, out walking her terrier, saw everything. "Hey, get away from that child!" she bellowed, her voice cutting through the moment like a blade. The man hesitated. His grip loosened. Just enough. Lan Chi ripped her arm free and bolted. Hong caught her just as the van screeched away, tires screaming and rubber burning into the pavement. Lan Chi buried her face into her mother's shoulder and trembled. But she didn't cry. She didn't speak. Not a word escaped her lips from that moment on. When the FBI arrived, seasoned agent Min Trung quickly assessed the scene. "She fits the pattern," he muttered grimly. 4 other children had gone missing under nearly identical circumstances. But without Lan Chi's voice, there was little to build the case on. Trauma had stolen her words, and with them, the only clear path to justice. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air at Dr. Laura Bennett's Animal Rehabilitation Center, mingling with the quiet rustle of fur and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. On a large orthopedic bed by the window lay a German shepherd, motionless, scarred, yet alert. His name was Wei, once a decorated K-9 officer, now a retired warrior bearing the weight of battles both seen and unseen. A jagged scar ran down his flank, a brutal reminder of the night that ended his career. During a raid to rescue a kidnapped child, Wei had lunged without hesitation at an armed suspect. A knife meant for an officer cut deep into his side. He had stopped the threat, but the damage left him permanently impaired. In the months that followed, he was deemed unfit for service. The department, pressed for resources, made the impossible decision: euthanasia. But Dr. Bennett saw something others didn't. Behind his weathered eyes still burned the fire of purpose. She fought to adopt him, convinced his loyalty and instincts could still change lives. She was right. Now, seated across from her in a small consultation room, Hong sat wringing her hands, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Beside her, little Lan Chi stood in silence, half hidden behind her mother's arm. It had been 2 weeks since the abduction attempt. The child had not spoken a single word. Dr. Bennett knelt, her voice soft and warm. "Hi, Lan Chi. My name is Laura. I work with special dogs, dogs who help kids feel safe again." Lan Chi said nothing, but her eyes flicked toward Wei. The shepherd sat patiently, his posture calm, his eyes fixed gently on the child. He didn't approach. He simply waited. "You don't have to come closer," Laura continued. "But if you want, you can put out your hand. He'll come to you." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Lan Chi stepped forward, her hand lifting with trembling uncertainty. Wei didn't move until Laura nodded. Then he took one step, then another, careful, deliberate, until his nose brushed her palm. Her fingers curled into his fur. Hong gasped. It was the first time her daughter had reached for anyone. A silent connection had been made. And in that moment, hope flickered, born not of words, but of trust. In the days that followed that first touch, something unspoken began to grow between Lan Chi and Wei. The little girl, once paralyzed by fear, now spent hours lying beside the German shepherd on the living room floor. She still didn't speak. Not to her parents, not to her therapists, but her hands never left his fur. She would trace the long scar on his side with her tiny fingers. Her gaze focused and distant, as though trying to understand the story etched into his flesh. Wei never pulled away. He simply lay still, breathing gently, as if he knew that he was the only safe place left in her world. At night, the nightmares still came. Hong and her husband would wake to find their daughter thrashing in bed, caught in silent panic. But instead of crying out, Lan Chi would cling to Wei. His presence grounded her. His steady heartbeat, his warmth, those were the only things that soothed her when nothing else could. Though she refused to speak, Lan Chi began to draw again. Her crayons scratched silently across paper, forming pictures of a little girl and a large dog standing between shadows. Always the same scene, the dog protecting the girl from a faceless figure looming in the background. Her parents hung the drawings on the refrigerator, their hearts breaking with each one, but grateful that their daughter was, at the very least, expressing herself again. One quiet afternoon, while sitting on the rug in Dr. Bennett's office, Lan Chi watched Wei perform a simple trick, lifting a paw when asked. Laura clapped softly. "Good boy," she said, beaming. Lan Chi's lips parted slightly. She leaned closer, eyes wide, and whispered, barely audible, "Good boy." It was the first time she had spoken since the attack. Hong froze. She turned, eyes wide, unsure if she had imagined it. But the look on Lan Chi's face said everything. The little girl seemed surprised by her own voice, like it had slipped out by accident. Tears welled in Hong's eyes. It wasn't a full recovery, not yet, but it was a beginning. Lan Chi still feared the world, but she trusted Wei. And sometimes trust is louder than words. The courtroom was heavy with tension as the trial of Lei Trong-min began. A man accused of attempting to abduct a child, now sitting calm and collected behind the defense table. He wore the face of a man with nothing to fear, his polished demeanor betraying none of the horror he was suspected of. Yet seated across from him, clinging tightly to the thick leash in her small hand, was 5-year-old Lan Chi, the only witness who had seen his face up close. Next to her sat Wei, his large frame poised and alert, ears flicking at every shift in the room. The court had granted special permission for the therapy dog to accompany Lan Chi, a decision met with both empathy and skepticism. Some believed his presence could unfairly sway the jury. Others knew that without him, Lan Chi wouldn't have the strength to appear at all. Judge Nguyen Phuc, a man with decades of experience, scanned the room. He understood the weight of the moment. The prosecution's entire case rested on a child who hadn't spoken since the day her innocence was nearly stolen. As the opening statements began, the silence around Lan Chi was deafening. The prosecutors painted a vivid picture of the attempted abduction, how Min had lured Lan Chi with promises of puppies, how he'd grabbed her arm, how she had frozen with terror. But the defense countered with logic and doubt. No physical evidence, no confession, no verbal testimony from the child. They argued that a traumatized 5-year-old couldn't be trusted to identify anyone. Then came the moment. Lan Chi was gently led to the witness stand. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering quiet reassurance. Wei followed closely, settling beside her with a quiet huff. The courtroom watched as the little girl, dwarfed by the wooden chair, gripped the leash tightly. "Lan Chi," the prosecutor said gently, "can you tell us who was with you that day?" She didn't speak. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table. Then, slowly, her hand lifted. She pointed directly at Lei Trong-min. Gasps echoed. It was not a word, but it was clear. And justice, for the first time, stirred in the silence. As Lan Chi sat quietly on the witness stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Her small frame was almost swallowed by the large wooden chair, her eyes cast downward, her grip on Wei's leash firm and unyielding. Judge Nguyen Phuc watched intently from the bench, his years on the bench telling him this was no ordinary testimony. The defendant, Lei Trong-min, sat stone-faced, arms folded, exuding an air of control. But beneath the calm, something darker stirred. The prosecutor, sensing Lan Chi's anxiety, stepped forward with care. "Lan Chi," she said softly, "you don't have to speak if you don't want to. You can just show us or signal anything you're comfortable with." Lan Chi didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes never lifting. Then, in a movement so subtle it could have been missed, her fingers twitched, a small deliberate motion, like a whisper in the air. To most, it meant nothing. But to Wei, it meant everything. The German Shepherd's entire body went still. Then slowly, his ears perked forward. A low, rumbling growl rose from his chest, not loud, not threatening, but full of unmistakable warning. His gaze locked onto Min, unwavering and intense. The courtroom reacted instantly. A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Even Judge Phuc leaned forward, eyebrows knitting together. "Order," he commanded, striking the gavel, but his own voice was edged with concern. Something had shifted. Something real. Vey didn't move, but his growl deepened. His hackles rose ever so slightly, and he inched forward, placing himself between Lan Chi and the man across the room. The reaction was instinctual, primal. This was no trained performance. This was recognition. "Your Honor," the defense attorney barked. "This is theatrics, the child and the dog. This is emotional manipulation." Judge Fook ignored him. He was focused entirely on Vey. "Miss Ha," he said to the prosecutor, "has this animal had any prior interaction with the defendant?" "No, Your Honor," she replied, though even she looked shaken. The judge paused. "Then I believe this reaction deserves further investigation." And just like that, the tide of the trial shifted, on the back of a silent signal and the growl of a dog who remembered what a monster looked like. The courtroom was still abuzz from the startling reaction of Vey, the retired K-9, when the prosecution team sprang into action. Assistant District Attorney Ha, eyes sharp with realization, leaned over to whisper something to her co-counsel. Moments later, an investigator slipped quietly out of the room, clutching a file of freshly analyzed forensic evidence. What had seemed like a symbolic gesture, bringing a dog into the courtroom for emotional support, had suddenly taken on new weight. Vey wasn't just comforting a child, he was pointing to a predator. By that evening, FBI agent Min Trong and his team were speeding toward a remote wooded area, guided by new soil samples found in Lei Trong Min's van. The data pointed to a secluded property registered under a shell company linked to Min's employer. The closer they got, the denser the forest grew. A sense of unease hung in the air like fog. As the agents approached the rundown cabin, Vey grew visibly agitated. His ears were up, his nose twitching, his muscles taut. With a low growl, he pulled toward the back of the structure, pacing near the rear wall like he'd been there before. "He knows something's here," Trong muttered, his hand resting on his weapon. "Trust the dog." Inside, the cabin was sparse, a table, a cot, canned food stacked in the corner. But then Trong noticed it, a subtle seam in the floorboards near the back wall. He knelt, tapped once, hollow. With a nod, officers pried up the boards to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Flashlights flickered as they stepped into the basement, the air damp and suffocating. And there, curled in the farthest corner chained to the wall, was a girl. Dirty, thin, silent, but alive. It was Than Mai, an 8-year-old who had vanished 6 months ago. Her eyes widened at the sight of people. Her mouth opened in a hoarse whisper. "Help!" Vey let out a soft whine, pushing forward until he was nose to nose with the girl, as if offering her comfort she hadn't known in months. Tears filled Agent Trung's eyes as he radioed in. "We've found her. She's alive." The horror they'd uncovered confirmed what they feared most. Min was no first-time offender. He was a serial predator. And thanks to a dog's instinct, his nightmare was about to end. The courtroom was packed as news of Than Mai's rescue rippled through the town like wildfire. The tension was thick, every seat filled with reporters, officials, and families clinging to the hope that justice would finally prevail. At the center of it all sat Lei Trong Min, once composed and defiant, now pale and sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights. His fingers tapped nervously against the defense table, no longer in control, because the truth was closing in. Assistant District Attorney Ha stood with quiet resolve as she addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady. "New forensic evidence confirms that soil from the defendant's van matches samples taken from the basement of the cabin where Than Mai was found. More importantly, the chains restraining the child carried his DNA." A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery. Ha didn't stop there. Tire tracks from the property matched the defendant's vehicle, and most crucially, Than Mai is alive. She has identified Min as her captor. Min's attorney, clearly rattled, leaned in, whispering furiously. But the man who had once sat smug and unshaken now looked like a ghost of himself. He shifted in his seat, his composure unraveling by the second. And then, just as Hat turned to present her final piece of evidence, Vey, still lying quietly at Lan Chi's feet, lifted his head. His body stiffened, eyes narrowed, hackles raised. The courtroom went silent. Slowly, Vey stood, his gaze locked on Min with piercing intensity. He took one deliberate step forward, then another, issuing a low, growling sound that vibrated through the room like a drumbeat of reckoning. Min flinched, the mask cracked, In a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered to his lawyer, "I want to change my plea." Judge Fook leaned forward. "Mr. Min, are you stating that you wish to plead guilty?" All eyes turned to him. The room was deathly still. "Yes," Min said, his voice hollow. Gasps echoed again, but this time they were followed by tears. Of relief, of sorrow, of long-awaited closure. The predator was unmasked, the silence had been broken, and the growl of a loyal dog had pushed evil into the light. The days after the sentencing were quiet, but not in the way they had been before. For the first time in weeks, the silence in the Carter household no longer felt suffocating. It felt like healing. The monster who had haunted their daughter's nights and stolen her voice was now behind bars for life, never to hurt another child again. Justice had been served, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the heart of a little girl who had found the strength to face her fears, with the help of a dog who never left her side. Lan Chi still didn't speak much. Words were coming slowly, as if her voice was relearning how to exist in a world that felt safe again. But something had shifted inside her. Something steady, something brave. Every morning, she would wake up and shuffle into the living room where Vei lay waiting. She would curl up beside him, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her eyes closed, breathing in the warmth of his fur like a child clinging to a lighthouse in a storm that had finally passed. Her parents watched from the hallway, never interrupting those sacred moments. They had learned that recovery wasn't loud. Sometimes it was quiet and still, wrapped in the heartbeat of a dog who had once been trained for war, now offering peace. Then one afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the floor in golden streaks, Lan Chi knelt in front of Vei, gently taking his face in her hands. She looked into his eyes for a long time, and in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "Thank you." Hong dropped the dish she was drying. It shattered on the floor, but she didn't move. Her hands trembled. Her husband, standing behind her, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Lan Chi smiled, just a small one, but real, and Vei wagged his tail in response, pressing his nose against her cheek. In that moment, it was clear. While evil had tried to break her, love had helped her rebuild. Not the loud kind of love, but the kind that waits patiently, never asks for anything in return, and shows up in the form of 4 strong legs and a heart that never gave up. Some heroes don't wear capes. Some heroes walk on paws. This story is not just about a crime or a courtroom victory. It's about the extraordinary bond between a child and a dog, and the power of silent love in the face of unspeakable trauma. Lan Chi lost her voice, her sense of safety, and the lightness of childhood in a matter of moments. But through Vei, an old, scarred canine who had once saved lives and nearly lost his own, she found something no therapy, no words could replace: trust. Vei didn't need to speak. He didn't need to understand psychology or the legal system. He simply stayed. He listened when no one else could hear. He guarded when no one else knew danger was near. And when the world needed the truth the most, he spoke in the only way he could, through instinct, presence, and courage. This story reminds us that animals are not just companions. They are sentient, emotional beings capable of love, loyalty, and even heroism. Vei was once discarded, seen as unfit, but his heart never stopped serving. He wasn't just a therapy dog. He was a protector, a witness, and a savior. Let this be a reminder. The way we treat animals matters. We must respect their lives, their stories, and their place in ours. Every shelter dog, every retired service animal, every creature with a scar holds a story of survival and strength. So today, let's honor them. Let's love them. Let's fight for them as fiercely as they fight for us. Because sometimes, the strongest voices come from those who cannot speak. And the truest heroes walk beside us, not on 2 feet, but on 4. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the powerful episodes we have coming next. Stories that will inspire, touch your heart, and sometimes even change how you see the world. We'd also love to hear from you. What did this story mean to you? Did it remind you of a special animal in your life? Or a moment when love and loyalty made a difference? Please take a moment to leave a comment below. Your thoughts, feedback, and stories help us grow and bring even more meaningful content to our community. We read every single one, and they truly matter. Thank you for being here, and stay tuned for the next incredible chapter.